I'm Jimin Q. I'm Dean of the Engineering School. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this inaugural Dean's Lecture. The Engineering Dean's Lecture was established to honor an individual who has played major leadership roles in and has made significant contributions to society through working in areas related to computer science, engineering, and technology. Today, we are fortunate to have Mr. Jeff Rothschild as our inaugural speaker. Jeff best exemplifies the intent of this lecture series. He received his bachelor degree in psychology from Vanderbilt University's College of Art and Science, and his master's degree in computer science from Vanderbilt's School of Engineering, where he was a member of the first graduate level computer science class. After realizing that he did not want to get a PhD, he went to work for Honeywell, later at Intel and Philips, to gain some real-world experience before starting his own path to become a serial entrepreneur. A word of warning for the PhD student in this room: don't get any wrong ideas. Don't drop out of your PhD programs unless you can think that you could be Jeff Rothschild II. In 1983, Jeff quit his day job and co-founded a company called Tolerant Systems, a company that specializes in data storage management softwares. The company wasn't a complete success, as he was telling me this morning. However, another company, Veritas Software, rose from the ashes of a Tolerant System, became very successful, and later was acquired by Symantec for $13.5 billion. A handsome payoff indeed. Once an entrepreneur, always an entrepreneur. Throughout the next few years, Jeff continued on starting several successful companies, including Empath Interactive in 1995, an online PC gaming service company that went to IPO 4 years later. In 2005, life took an unexpected turn for Jeff. As an advisor in the venture capital firm, Jeff was asked to help in the hiring of the vice president of engineering for a little tiny company at that time called the Facebook. Started very recently by a certain dropout from Harvard. What Jeff did then was unimaginable. Some of you may even consider that borderline unethical. Instead of hiring someone else, he hired himself. So in 2005, Jeff officially joined Facebook as the vice president of infrastructure engineering. Jeff, I can only admire your courage and the patience to be willing working in a company run by a bunch of know-it-all 20-year-old. Well, the truth is, according to a Forbes magazine article, I quote, "Though Zuckerberg jokingly called him a lousy recruiter, the Facebook CEO understood Rothschild's value as the company's fixed-out mechanic and asked him to join the company is an elder statesman to arbitrate the disagreement and to pick up the fight should that happen, unquote. I added the very last part of it. Nevertheless, Jeff did bring extensive experience, deep knowledge of network storage systems, and real-world skills to a very young startup. He was, literally and figuratively, the only adult in the room. No doubt that Jeff's experience and wisdom have helped Facebook navigate through its early years of growing pains. And his technical know-how has enabled the rapid scale-up of Facebook's massive network as we know it today. As Facebook's Chief Technology Officer, Michael Schwenfer, put it, quote, "Since the early days, Jeff has been a linchpin for Facebook's technical success. So much of the company's journey from being a humble startup to becoming a truly global platform can be mapped back to Jeff's work and expertise," unquote. I didn't make any of that up. In addition to being a serial entrepreneur and a successful tech company executive, Jeff is also an active philanthropist and civic leader. He is currently a trustee at the Vanderbilt University and served on the board of a number of nonprofit organizations such as, sorry. Didn't mean that. Sorry, I gave it up your talk. He's on the board of FIAC's Lax Foundation, which provides funding for KCI Eye Care Institute, a hospital that provides eye surgery in Kenya. His philanthropy has also provided support for a Kenyan dairy cooperative called Dairy Farms Chiranani. Jeff is also a big supporter of Tufts. Together with his wife, they established in 2005 the Jeffrey Marikek Rothschild Endowed Scholarship Funds. Thank you, Jeff, for your generosity and support. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I give you the inaugural Dean's lecture speaker, Jeff Rothschild.
Well, thank you very much, Dean Q. So as was just mentioned, I actually was a psych student. And when I was 18 years old, I think I had my life all figured out. It was pretty clear I could be a psychologist. I'd sit in a chair and let people tell me their problems and charge them. It seemed like a wonderful way to earn a living. So I went ahead and became a psych major at Vanderbilt. It was a great time. I truly admit that I enjoyed psychology very much. And before we go too deep into this, let me just say a few words of introduction. Nothing that I'm going to say today should be taken as the gospel truth. We all interpret the world based on our own experience, and what I'm going to say has a lot to do with my experience. And somebody who maybe came to entrepreneurship or through a different path would have interpreted things in a different way and might have drawn very different conclusions. So please don't assume that, well, if Rothschild says it, that must be the way it is. It's the way I see it. And then we'll continue here. So anyway, I was going to be a psych major. I was enjoying it. There's nothing wrong with it. Changing from it wasn't a statement of dissatisfaction with the space. And in fact, I even gained a little bit of notoriety. That was me at the age of 21, I guess. I would have been a junior, being interviewed by another 21-year-old who was a junior TV reporter, who I will admit embarrassed me terribly on television, and I told her so recently. For some reason, I had forgotten her name, so I didn't know it was Oprah Winfrey until she put this on TV about 5 years ago for some reason that I still don't quite understand. But regardless, things were going fine in psychology. But the kind of work I was doing was just working with the various professors at the school who were involved in developmental psychology. So I was spending time observing children's play behavior, looking for hints of creativity, or measuring the self-esteem of 5-year-old girls after they've either seen All in the Family or the Mary Tyler Moore Show to determine the effect of female character roles on self-image. But what I was really doing was taking that data and punching it up using a punch card machine and writing Fortran software to analyze these observations. And it occurred to me one day while I was working on writing a program and feeding it through the hopper in the computer center that I hadn't a clue how this hardware worked. It was magic, and it bothered me. I didn't like using something that I truly couldn't understand. And in fact, I'll admit I was somewhat in awe of the people who could build a machine like this. And looking at that one day, I said, you know, this stuff's going to be really important. I'm sure I'm going to be using it. I'd rather know how it worked and set out to actually build a computer myself, and realized, well, the best way for me to do that was maybe go to school of computer science. So I gave up my plans to continue in psychology, applied to graduate school in computer science. I had to throw this in because I hear the term code reuse a good bit. And those of us who work in software know what that means. Well, what it used to mean was you would steal code out of one program and physically take it to another, slip it in the program at the right place behind the rubber band holding that code together. And if you wanted to use the code back in the original program again, you needed to remember to bring it back. It's a very different world we live in today. So when I was in graduate school, I somehow drifted towards some fairly arcane corners of computer science. I love coding in machine language, and this is the console of the machine that I would use. It was a Xerox Sigma 7 computer. I used to enjoy coding, skipping the assembler. I would just write in hex, and in the case of the PDP-10 in octal, just to show off a little bit. I think that if I'd stayed in psychology, I probably could have diagnosed that condition, but in reality, I was just having fun. When I left school, I, at that point, was confident I wanted to be an entrepreneur. Only problem is I hadn't a clue what I could build that anybody would want. So I did the next best thing, which was take a job, and as Dean Q mentioned, I went to Honeywell. Stayed there just a couple months, and somebody I knew at Intel called me up while I was at Honeywell and said that they had a pretty serious business problem. They'd built a large system that was emulating a physical disk, and it was all done in solid-state memory, and it was slower than the physical disk. And I said, well, that's crazy. It shouldn't be slower than a physical disk. And he said, well, will you come here and fix it? I agreed. I quit Honeywell and was going to start at Intel the next week, maybe 2 weeks later. And I started reading in a trade rag called Computer World that Intel had solved this problem. They had an interview with the GM, and they had a solution to the problem. So I called up my friend and said, well, that's sort of false advertising. I thought I was going to get to work on this thing. And he goes, well, you are. We were just pre-announcing your fix. Well, at that point, I didn't know a lot about drinking, but I figured it was never too late to start because I wasn't anticipating being able to get to sleep at night for a little bit. After being at Intel for a few weeks, I did find the problem. It was actually machine coding. They had just misinterpreted how some of their machine instructions on the processor worked. But it was an awful lot of fun, and I really enjoyed that experience. And so I settled in at Intel. And this is what settling at Intel almost looked like, except for plants being on the edge of a cubicle. Andy Grove, the president of Intel, never would have allowed something as dangerous as a plant being on a cubicle. He liked offices to be very neat. But that was the general environment, and it was a fantastic company. There would have been a lot of really interesting things to do there, and if I had been excited by the opportunities of leading people within a company like that or building out new product groups within Intel, I would have stayed. But I was a little bit bored. When I started at Intel, I was facing certain failure and humiliation, on a project that I had, been overconfident about and sort of lucked into solving. And I wanted that thrill again of sort of knowing I was likely to fail. So I struck out on my own, and it was an interesting decision because it wasn't necessarily the right thing to do. There would have been a lot of ways to have built a career at the company. But maybe striking out on my own is probably the right way to describe it, because most everything I did failed. And I know that it's a cliche to say that you learn more from the projects that fail than the ones that succeed. Well, sometimes things become a cliche because they're true. You really do learn from failure. And I'll just mention a couple of these companies and projects and what I got out of each one. First product I built was a universal printer cable system. There was a problem in the computer industry at the time of about 12 different small personal computer vendors and maybe a dozen printer vendors. They all had separate cable SKUs, and it was impossible for a computer store to stock all the various combinations. I built a system where you could plug a end from a Commodore to the end for a Data South printer, connect the two, and everything would work. What I learned was that once there's a leader in the industry, everybody can converge very quickly on a standard. The release of the IBM PC made that obsolete inside of 6 months. I then built a solid-state memory system for PCs, sort of like a mini version of what I had built at Intel. You sort of do what you know. And I sold a few, but the lesson I learned here is that the commodity platform advances so much faster than an add-on peripheral, because I only had a few customers and I was the only engineer. Intel had thousands of people working on this, and very shortly, the amount of memory I was adding was irrelevant. I then worked on pre-printed forms a few years later for dot matrix printers. And again, what's a dot matrix printer? The shift to laser printers made that obsolete, and I think the only place you can find one today is at a car dealer when you buy a car. They still use a dot matrix printer. Started a company called Tolerant Systems, as the dean mentioned. And the lesson I learned was that there wasn't a market for fault-tolerant computers. It was misunderstood. There was a market for systems with high integrity, but nobody bought them because they didn't stop. And fairly recently, early 2000s, I helped start a company to do continuous backup. And it worked. It was elegant, but it was completely unnecessary. The people who needed it actually had worked around the problem years earlier, and that was an observation that simply had escaped me. So a lot of things failed, but a number of them succeeded. And we'll mention a bit about those in passing, but I figured I'd also just give some general lessons I learned about being an entrepreneur. And the first one is, don't do it alone unless it really is something that is best done by one person. And some of those opportunities come up. It's really a team sport. It's sort of like a high school basketball team could probably beat Michael Jordan, pretty much any high school basketball team, because basketball at its essence is in fact a team sport. As an entrepreneur, you don't possess all of the skills yourself, but you bring together a half dozen people, 3 or 4 people. The combination of your skills is greater than what any individual has. The combination of your knowledge is going to be greater than what one person has. And don't underestimate the value of somebody who can, give you immediate feedback, tell you you're full of it, without your having to go out and make expensive mistakes. Don't play a fair game. This is hard. Most companies fail. So look for some unfair advantage. That unfair advantage can be that you have deep domain knowledge about a particular technology. It could be that you, through working at a summer job, gained some insight into how badly something is done today, and you can think of a better way to solve that problem. Maybe it's a personal relationship that you've developed with someone who can be your first customer, and that can be the beachhead for actually entering a difficult industry. It could be almost anything, but try to find that unfair advantage, tilt the field in your direction. Obviously, if you're good at something, then that's probably a good place to start. Don't pick an area that is outside of where your domain expertise may be. If you find somebody who's better at the role that you've chosen for yourself in this new endeavor, well, hire them. Put yourself in some other role. Do something where you're going to have more impact. But don't be afraid to recognize that other people are going to have more experience or greater skills. And this is really, the last point here is really important. Keep your ego in check. And this applies to whether you're working as an entrepreneur, whether you're working in a corporate setting. I've just seen so many people torpedo their careers because they cared so much about what was on their business card, what their title was. There's a mistaken notion that you build a resume through job titles. Well, guess what? You don't. You build a resume through success and impact. Do what you're best at, do where you'll have the impact. Too many sad stories of people who finish their career with a succession of failures because they had to be some title. Good qualities for an engineer, well, these are good for an entrepreneur. These are probably good qualities for practically anything that you would do. It's not a part-time job. There'll be other people likely trying to do what you're doing. So if you're not completely focused on it, you're probably not going to succeed. Your motivation should be success, not proving you're right. If what you need to do changes because your assumptions were wrong, it's a little bit dangerous if you're still thinking, no, I've got to prove that thesis I was writing in school really was going to be important in the industry. That's a bad basis on which to be an entrepreneur. Again, domain knowledge is great to have. Persistence, things will go wrong. Keep pushing forward until the right point. And we'll talk about that in a moment. And probably most importantly, it's self-awareness. Self-awareness is about being open about your own limitations, what you know and what you don't know, what your team knows, and what you know about yourself. So it's okay to not have all the answers. And if you're going to raise money from someone, don't pretend you have every answer because they'll see through that very quickly. It's okay to have unproven skills. We all have skills that are unproven at some point. But it's sort of not okay to not know that. And so self-awareness really is key. The person who knows what they don't know will know how to learn it. The person who doesn't won't, and they're not going to learn from the experiences around them. Okay. This is a pretty important idea, and that is the difference between having an idea for something and actually executing about it. So ideas are pretty cheap. Execution is not. Okay, so the graphic here is really just a joke. But the point is serious, maybe even deadly serious, because this slide pretty well explains, why an idea is so different from execution. The idea of landing on Mars is pretty easy to come by. People have been writing about that for 120 years. Executing that idea very obviously isn't. So a useful thought exercise. How often have you seen a product in the market? Somebody builds a new website, a product is delivered, and you say to yourself, I was thinking about that. I had that idea. Well, that's going to happen. But these are great times to stop and ask yourself, well, why didn't I do it? And there could be good reasons why you didn't do it. I mean, it may have been that you were busy doing something else. There was an opportunity cost for your embarking on that path. It may have been, maybe you were in school. There was a better way to use your time at that point. It could have been that, well, you just didn't have knowledge within that domain, but you did have some insight that this would be a valuable product. But whatever conclusion you reach is simply an opportunity to potentially change your behavior the next time you think about something and say, okay, I don't want that to be a case where I see it 5 years later, and think back about what could have happened. So not surprisingly, probably the most important advice I could ever give to an aspiring entrepreneur is, again, I just borrow somebody else's marketing slogan, but just do it. Okay, if you've got the skills to build something, if you've got the inclination to build something, then trying it says a tremendous amount about you. On the other hand, not doing it says something about you as well. And it's not necessarily something bad. Following an entrepreneurial path is not necessarily the right decision for everyone to make, but actions speak louder than words. And if you try something and fail, you've really said a lot about your willingness to take action. So another thought exercise. Imagine that you're an investor. You're looking to put money into a new startup, and somebody comes into your office. And there's sort of two kinds of people you might be seeing, and decide who you'd want to invest in. Somebody who shows you a PowerPoint, like I am today, or somebody who shows you a prototype. Somebody who walks you through a 3-inch thick business plan, or someone who gives you a product demo. Probably the best way to say that is somebody who does a lot of talking, or somebody who's established that they have a knack for doing. It's pretty obvious where you're going to go. So given if you're thinking about being an entrepreneur, you're going to find yourself on the other side of that table. So you can imagine what that person is looking for. And your behavior will have the biggest impact on, up to that point, your behavior and how much action you've taken will go a long way towards convincing someone that you're somebody they can invest with. So if you've ever been to the Facebook campus, you will have seen slogans that sound a lot like what we have here. But these are more than just slogans. They really are important concepts. Moving fast dramatically reduces your risk. It reduces the opportunity cost, because the most valuable resource you have is your time. So if you spend less time on something because you moved quickly, then you've lowered the cost. It is going to reduce your competitive risk, because other people might be trying to do the same thing, and capital risk. I mean, the amount of money you spend is going to be a function of how long you worked on something or how long your team works on it. So moving fast reduces risk. You got to learn fast. Whatever assumptions you had when you started out probably have changed by the time you finish. So keep your eyes open. The phrase I like to tell people is that you should be appalled about how little you knew about something 6 months ago, because that's the rate you should be learning. That you should be able to look back and say, what an idiot I was. If you think that way, then you probably are doing something right. If you could recognize those areas. And fail quickly. Don't drag it out. And I'm sure you're thinking, but didn't he just say you should be persistent? Well, yeah, that's where a little bit of art comes in as opposed to science. You have to know, okay, this is something I can push through. It can be overcome. That's a normal setback. But there's some point where you will probably recognize that this is a bad idea. A small company may not be able to enter this space. Or maybe the idea itself becomes obsolete before it's completed. Opportunity cost is all that you really have. Our life is a countdown, and don't use it working on the wrong problem. Most people who've started successful projects, successful companies, have failed on a couple of them before that they happen to have one where it all came together. But I've known folks who've ground it out for 10 years on a dead end, and that's really sad. Okay. You have to think about your product, and I threw this slide up here because many people think that what you do is put months into building a complex business plan, where you do full competitive analysis and describe your distribution channel and the rest. Probably not. There was a time that every new project was, that somebody would build that business plan, but rarely today, as an investor, do you see people coming in with these formal plans. Most likely it's a presentation, or better yet, it's a prototype showing that they've got some ideas around the product, and here's the basic framework of what it will take to build it and potentially sell it. So what I generally tell people to do when they're trying to explore a product opportunity is tell a story. You know, how will people use the product? Why would they use it? What are they doing today? Describe what their life looks like today, and that what the scenario for using, for getting done whatever it is they do, what that would look like once your product existed. This is tremendously valuable. It'll be useful when you sell your product later on. It'll be useful for trying to raise money as you communicate your plans to an investor. And it'll help you understand, well, what is the minimum viable product that I can deliver, so that you're not doing more than you need to, and maybe help decide what moves into your product roadmap. Okay, obviously you should know your product. But what I mean by that is not just know it at a superficial level, not just describe what it is, but describe why someone uses it. And you know, I can mention two of the companies that Dean Q mentioned. Veritas Software, we built a very technical product. It was a file system and a logical volume manager that were extensions to the Unix operating system. And if someone would ask me, what are you building? Or what does Veritas do? I could certainly have answered the question by saying a file system and a volume manager. But what was much more useful was to say that we were building software that would improve the availability and integrity of data on a computer system. And that provided more insight into how to build this product, the type of trade-offs to make, and what to build as follow-on products. Facebook, everyone knows it as a social network, but is that really useful? I mean, MySpace was a social network. MySpace, though, was a social network for 16-year-olds who wanted to show the world their personality, who they were, maybe find other people who had similar interests, loved the same bands. But that wasn't Facebook. Facebook was a social utility that would attempt to be the most efficient way to share information with people who mattered to you, and for you to be able to consume information from those same individuals. That was a useful description. So try to think deeply about the product. Generally, your competition isn't another company. Usually it's the way people are doing things today. In the case of Veritas, the competition was people's reticence to use Unix in commercial applications. They'd use it in engineering applications, in scientific, but there was legitimate reticence about using Unix, today Linux, in a commercial application because of concerns about its integrity. For Facebook, well, was the competition MySpace? And I already said, no, it isn't. It would have offered no value to Facebook to say, that's who I'm working against. What was valuable was to think, well, what do people do today? So for Facebook, they used email, which was a very inefficient way to communicate with your friends and keep them aware of what's going on in your life. I would jokingly tell people that the real competition was the Christmas letter, because we'd know we were successful if you didn't receive any of these anymore. And for those of you who never received a Christmas letter, it's a finely typed, copied page that describes everything that happened in somebody's family over the course of the year. And I would kid people that if Facebook was successful, nobody would feel the need to send one because they knew that their friends already knew what had gone on with their family that year. Let's take another company, Uber. Is there competition cab companies? Well, clearly the cab companies feel that that's the case. But if you ask the folks at Uber, they'll tell you that the competition is really private automobile ownership. And their real goal is to change people's behavior so that those living in an urban environment don't feel the need to own a car. And the list can just go on. I mean, Grubhub, is the competition a food delivery service? No. Is you schlepping that food yourself? So when you start thinking about a product idea, there's a tendency to try to build something that everybody can use. But that's not necessarily the best way to enter a market, because you can't sell to everybody anyway, and not every product involves sales, but if you even think about a service, you can't necessarily meet everyone's need. And sales is really, really tough. Gaining adoption for a new online product is really tough. Getting attention is hard. If you can focus on a smaller audience that really needs what you do, then there's less for you to build, because you're not trying to meet everyone's needs, and there's less for you to test, and marketing becomes easier because you have a very clear target of who you're trying to address. So less of a product is often more, highly focused. And don't worry so much about the size of the market, because whatever you're building probably has a larger market than you're able to address at this point. You can't afford to sell to everyone. It's like if you're fishing and you're in some lake and you say, okay, my problem is that I need to be there aren't enough fish in the lake, I need to go to the ocean. You're probably making a mistake, because the density of fish in the ocean is probably not any greater, it may be less. True, there's total more fish there. A lot of companies make this mistake. I've seen young companies that are achieving a certain level of sales, and they say, well, I'm only on the Mac, I need to now build a version for the PC. And I'll tell them, there's enough people out there with Macs. If you were building a compelling product, you'd have a successful business today. Don't waste your time trying to support another platform. Think about what's wrong with your product. Okay. I think the common metaphor here is sharks when you're raising money. There's a lot of ways to get funded today. The world is very different than it was even 10 years ago. We've got crowdfunding. You have angel investments. If you've looked at a site like AngelList, you'll see that a lot of people work through these non-traditional means to gain certainly seed funding and early stage funding. Even in the venture space, a lot of companies today do convertible debt as opposed to a Series A. So there's a lot of ways to get this done. But the biggest mistake people make is getting hung up about valuation. Most projects fail. You're more likely, you should be worried about that binary difference between failure and success than thinking about getting an extra 10% of equity out of the company when you are a successful company and you're worth hundreds of millions of dollars. So the best advice I could give here is don't worry about equity, don't worry about percentages, just worry about having the partners who can help you and having enough money so that you give yourself enough runway, because it always takes longer to build something, and it certainly takes longer to sell something. There are clearly runaway successes, we all know about them, but that's not the common case. The common case is somebody slogs away at something for 3 years and then becomes a runaway success when they finally have the model figured out. There was an entrepreneur I met many years ago, a fairly well-known fellow who, when I was talking to him, said, you know, I think the secret to success is not going out of business, which on the surface sounds pretty stupid, but what he really meant was just make sure that you don't end up having to close the doors for the wrong reason. As I mentioned, sales is really tough. This is supposed to be a person who's been on the phone all day and is demoralized and exhausted. But I can tell you, there's an awful lot of noise out there. When I was at Facebook, and I left Facebook last year, I would probably get 20 to 30 unsolicited emails from different legitimate hardware and software vendors daily who were convinced that Facebook really would benefit from what they were building. If I paid attention to that, I never could have done my job. So I would very reluctantly, look through the list, and if something really jumped out at me, maybe once in a month, be willing to entertain a phone discussion. This is hard to do. People have a lot of demands on their time. So sales is really tough. You really need to put things together like the pieces of a puzzle. You have an audience that you can afford to reach, because you can't do mass market advertising. It needs to be people who you can contact in some way, and the sales cycle has to be short enough that you'll be able to gain some business in a meaningful time frame. You need, some cases you have to do proof of concepts, and again, I'm really describing an enterprise model here, but the same process exists for an online service. You launch your product, you try to understand the people who are using it, the people who try it and give it up, understand their motivations, what led them to stop using the product, what's working for the people who it is, and then iterate, and then hopefully have a repeatable model that you can further invest in. As I mentioned, getting attention isn't easy. This is a small portion of the weather applications that are available on the Android App Store. I just did a search on weather, and I think it was 98 weather apps. If I was introducing the 99th, I'd be a little worried, because it's going to be very hard. Nobody's going to work through all 99 apps finding the best one, so getting people's attention is a challenge. How do you go about finding an opportunity? Well, a couple ideas that I think work pretty well. One of those is simplicity. In most competitive situations, simple wins. And when people enter a more mature market, it's usually because they've found some way to either simplify the user experience, simplify the sales process. They can reach the customer differently. The distribution process may be simpler. It might just be simpler to understand. But it's generally some dimension of simple can differentiate the new from the old. And if you see something that seems unnecessarily complex, it may be that the product isn't unnecessarily complex, but the way you buy it is complex. Recognition of something of unnecessary complexity is usually an opportunity to do something about it, and it's a sort of an inflection point for entering a market. And the other big inflection point is new platforms. And a platform doesn't necessarily mean something like the PC or the internet. I mean, these major shifts that happen at most every 10 years. It can be a software company that has achieved some success, and there's an opportunity to build extensions and add-ons around it. It can be a new peripheral, such as I'm showing the Oculus Rift here, or Bitcoin, or even just a market segment like big data. I mean, big data has a lot of underlying opportunities in storage and tools and visualization software. Clearly, the phone is a new platform. I know folks who did very well building applications for the iPhone when Apple just opened the App Store. These applications would never have attracted attention today, but when they're the only thing in the store, people would try it out. And so for a small company, those are your opportunities for entree, because the production values that are required to be competitive are lower. In a mature market, the people compete on what are the graphics like in the game? How many levels of gameplay are there? How deep is this experience? Well, early on, it's like, yeah, you actually have a puzzle game, and it's something I can do on my phone. That last icon I show on the right is something from Intel and Micron called 3D Crosspoint. I won't describe what it is here, but I bet somebody's going to figure out an interesting company to build around that memory technology. All right. I hope this animal doesn't exist. I saw the picture online and thought it was something that must have been extinct. But products need to change. And if you keep doing the same thing, it eventually becomes irrelevant. Failure is part of change. You can't predict in advance what changes are going to succeed. And this is one of the reasons that big companies eventually ossify and become irrelevant. They have something to protect, which is their current market. So given that there's more to lose, it's harder for them to do new things, to take risk. Small companies have less to lose. They can take risk. And companies that don't exist, that have no market, they can take any kind of risk. And it's that marketplace of of new ideas is sort of like the pool of mutations. Most mutations fail, well, most new companies fail, but out of those mutations, some of them succeed brilliantly. And once you've started a company, once you're working at a company, and many people are going to go into a company and build a meaningful and valid career there, keep aware of the fact that you've got to take risk. It's a tough thing to do. There's a lot of reasons why companies don't take risks, and we're going to touch on that in just a few minutes. So a few thoughts on management, and this is the 30-second course on management. There's a lot of things you could be doing as a manager. You could be worrying about your schedule. You could be worrying about setting goals, about the quality of your product, or some other metric. But if your team isn't on board, if the team isn't having fun, if they're not engaged with the company, then all those goals are going to be difficult to achieve. And if their team is engaged, then those other goals are going to be relatively easy, and certainly easier. So this is a very engineering view of the world, and maybe it's a software engineering view of the world, but I asked myself, what got me interested in computer science? And certainly it was that I could see a problem, I could imagine a solution in my head, and then I could go solve that problem. And I got a lot of fun and joy out of that process. I've interviewed 1,000 engineers, I'm sure, over the years, and not one person has ever told me that the reason that they majored in computer science was because they were excited about the idea of implementing other people's ideas. It just hasn't happened. But when you organize as a company, you sort of have to row the same direction. You need to have one person do this and one person do that. So there's this natural tension that exists between why people went into the field in the first place and what's needed to get a team to work together. And that's where good management comes into play. A manager who tells people what to do is probably going to have people who hate their job, and they'll have defection from the team and the company. If the manager defines the problem, gives people that opportunity to envision a solution, maybe ask some questions to help refine that solution, they can leave the room, and the people in that room still own the idea. They still own the work that they're working on. And when they need to make choices about where they put in their time, it's highly likely it goes with the company and with the project. So striking a balance is tough. This is somewhat of an art form, but a lot of people get it wrong. And when people hate their job, it's usually because somebody hasn't taken care to make sure that they're still doing the thing that got them into that space in the first place. I get asked about this a lot. How do you get your team to agree? The answer is you don't. It's not important. What is important is that, and the reason it isn't is because you've hired a lot of smart people. Your co-founders are smart people. You've joined a company full of smart people. Everybody has ideas. People aren't going to be on the same page necessarily. But being heard is essential. I would work at a company that makes the decision to do something that I didn't agree with. But if they didn't give me the opportunity to explain my position, I would turn around and walk out the door. And I think most people feel that way. So the way you deal with this dissension, which is going to happen, is make sure everybody is heard, acknowledge it, value those inputs, and then somebody's got to make a decision. It's not necessarily a democracy, but people who can't come on board with the decision following that kind of a process generally are lacking something in terms of their emotional maturity, and they're probably not going to be an asset to the company anyway. And of course, data is a great way to avoid conflict. I hate to use the term today. I used to say data trumps opinion, but excuse the term. Opinions, are much more variable than data. Data, you have it. There can be some discussion as to whether it's applicable to the problem you're solving, but the more data you have, the less time you waste trying to decide what to do. And when building a company or working at a company, make sure that failure is accepted. If it isn't, then people won't take risks. If the only people who get promotions are those who work on successful projects or the bonuses at the end of the year, only come from those whose products have had great success, then nobody's going to work on the high-risk project. So in building a company culture, you sort of define what you're going to get. And of course, it's okay to fail. Just like with self-awareness, it's not okay to know what you don't know. It's also not okay to not know you got it wrong. So build in the feedback loop that gets you, that allows you to pivot and eventually get it right. And hire people who care about the business. Pretty obvious. People who don't care create a lousy environment for those who do, and they probably need to be told what to do in a great deal of detail, which means heavyweight specifications, and that's not fun for anyone, for the people creating them or the people who are working from them. I slept through accounting. I have sometimes tried to estimate what that actually has cost me. This really is a business. Know at least, you don't have to necessarily take accounting, but at least read an article on how to work your way through a balance sheet. It's important to understand, and yeah, that's a mistake I made. This is sort of an unusual concept, and people have argued with me about this. They don't agree. I sometimes call this learning inefficiently, but there's real value in learning a little bit more than you need to learning the abstractions that underlay the tools and the systems that you work with. If you know how a compiler works, you're going to write better code than somebody who just uses the compiler. It's inevitable. If you understand the low-level abstractions of your business, maybe how the machine tool works, then as a designer of a part, you're going to deliver a better part to the machine shop. So it's deep knowledge helps you. I call this concept collateral knowledge. When you go looking for something, the most efficient way to find it is not necessarily the best way. It might be the fastest way. Using Stack Overflow as an example will get you to a solution to a problem quickly. But how does that compare to writing a test case and trying to understand how does this operating system API really behave when it's given the wrong data? I truly believe that you have to make the right trade-off for whatever it is, for the situation you're involved in. But if the person who asks a question or goes to a quick web search will get their work done more quickly, but the person who reads the source code, builds the test case, does some experimentation, I think eventually leaves that person in the dust. They simply will have more opportunities to grow. And when you repeat that process 1,000 times, you really can see the difference. So it's a little bit of a black and white judgment I'm making, but I've always tried to define they're the people who ask, and then there's the people who figure it out. And my askers will get the job done quicker, but given a year or two, the people who figure it out they're the ones people are going to ask, and they simply have more effective knowledge. So on that, we'll take some questions, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. I'm Karen Panetta from Electrical Engineering, and one of the things I really loved about your presentation was the constant messaging that failure is okay, because the number one reason that most of my students leave engineering is because of the fear of failure, especially young women. And one of the questions I always get that I don't have an appropriate answer for is, okay, I do this, I fail, but at what point I have to go back, I have to live, I have to survive, how do I live? And by the way, do you have a social life in between doing all this entrepreneurial work?
Well, one of those, of course, is if you're working in an effort that has raised money, you're probably going to be paid while you're failing. So being paid to fail is pretty cool. And so that would be one answer. The other is you can, balance. You can have some source of income, but still try things. But eventually, you're going to have to do it full time. So being able to get funded for something isn't that hard today. It used to be tough.
Hi, I'm Bill Messner in mechanical engineering. Thank you very much. I wanted to say that my father was a psychiatrist, so, you know, I have kinship like that. But on that topic of psychology, I'm interested in how your psychology education helped you with all that you have done.
I would hope that through the last hour, you'd recognize that a lot of my view of entrepreneurship has been formed by an understanding of what motivates people and what allows teams to work together. I can't point to any specific element of the curriculum in psychology, but I think it was simply having an awareness that the relationships between people and the people's need to address certain goals in their life are paramount. That's number one, and you have to then drive your commercial endeavor within the framework of meeting those objectives.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Hello, Jeff. I'm Ming Chow. I'm from computer science. Thank you so much for this presentation. This was fantastic. So my question is, of course, you have a very successful career, and you mentioned a lot about, you know, failure and successes in this presentation. If you had to do it all over again, what would you do differently?
I would have probably stayed awake in accounting. So no, I do think that not having a knowledge of venture finance, I didn't know how companies were valued. I didn't know what the expectations of investors were and where I should push back. So I can look at that as like one really simple area. I would have probably killed some projects earlier. And I mentioned the one project that where I learned that teamwork really mattered. I built all the hardware for the project. I did all the circuit design. And you know, the lesson I learned there was get somebody better than you at that. I should have gone out and been looking for a co-founder, another member of my team who had those skills rather than inefficiently trying to solve those problems myself.
Let's take one last question.
Hi, my name is Janet. I'm a junior computer science, and I have, I think, two questions. And thank you so much for the presentation, very motivating. So my first question is being young and probably in college, a junior, you have so many ideas, and you think about this, you see so many problems here and there, you think about a solution. But when do you actually break even and be like, okay, I'm going to follow this, or like actually execute this idea? And then okay, my other question, okay, I forgot, but
Well, let's address that one, because I touched on it. I used the term opportunity cost. If you're still on a steep portion of the learning curve, you're in school and there's a really relevant curriculum, stay with it. You're probably going to be in a better position to execute on ideas later on. If you feel that you have the skills you need to embark as an entrepreneur, that's probably the time to do it. I mean, I would never encourage anyone to drop out of school, but if you actually had this observation that, well, I'm attending class, but I'm not learning anything new, then maybe pursue one of those ideas at that time, and my apologies.
okay, thank you.
You're welcome.